I see the front page of the Guardian of today, the Wednesday, the 19th of August, 2020. And so the Daily Mirror, it's running on a slightly different story, but we'll come to that in detail in a minute. And the Sun resuming the snide coverage against Meghan Markle, and the Daily Express, unprecedented use of the word bloodbath, and it's not a complimentary item of news for Boris Johnson, but this is something that they have been forced to run. The Times is running on the Gavin Williamson debacle, disaster. Significantly, none of the papers so far we have seen is talking about the disappearance of Boris Johnson from the scene, while Gavin Williamson is taking the main attention. And here are two of the most corrupt specimens, embodiments of the corrupt conservative culture. And one is Jacob Rees-Mogg, and it's the Daily Boris Graph. And the Daily Mail is piling the pressure on Gavin Williamson, of course. And this is very much to the advantage, or to create an advantageous position for Boris Johnson, who is actually the one that said that the robbing of these students by downgrade was evidence of a good system, a robust system. And he wasn't actually challenged, as he said that even to the Channel 4 News camera. Channel 4 News, remember, was founded by campaigns carried out during the 1970s for filling the gap of an alternative that was not available, alternative to the BBC, BBC One, BBC Two channels, and ITV. There was no Sky News at the time. There was no Channel 5. There was no other terrestrial channel. But Channel 4 has been letting down the implicit promise, implicit in its foundation, and it's getting public funding for the promise to deliver alternative, factual, but alternative to the existing mainstream BBC and now Sky News and ITV. And when Boris Johnson bragged and boasted last week in front of Channel 4 News, without wearing a mask either, and said that the system that downgraded robbed the children of their grade was a good system, and it was a robust system. Now he is nowhere being seen or confronted or quizzed or questioned about that, since the about turn staged via Gavin Williamson and the others 2 days ago, which is covered in Tuesday's Fleet Street front pages and inside pages, being devoted to having a go at Gavin Williamson. Now, Gavin Williamson's record is bad. It goes without saying. But when it comes to actually fronting the regime, it is the fronter who needs to be focused on. And especially when the fronter has been exhibiting the effrontery of boasting, bragging of the robbing system, the system that robs children, then that fronter must be called to account, but he is not being. The only sample, which is a timid kind of Photoshop kind of display on the front page of the Daily Star, is this one. And it's a kind of image in the white shirt. It is Boris Johnson's image. And on one side is Dominic Cummings, who controls him. And on another side, it is Gavin Williamson. So they're saying the invisible man last spotted, well, it's really quite hard to say exactly, but we are pretty sure it was just before the doo-doo hit the fan over the exams fiasco. Now they're still carrying on using the word fiasco, even though they have a kind of creative idea about this front page cartoon character that they have constructed, but they're still calling it fiasco. They're not calling it crime, which is what it is, because it was a planned criminal or criminally confected algorithm that robbed the 60 or plus thousand children, whereas rewarding many less thousands of wealthy children who were not entitled to the good grade or better grade that they were given. So the newspapers are continuing to promote the idea that they are critical of they call it the fiasco, and we are calling it the criminality. Now, on the front page of the Boris Graph, which is the Daily Telegraph, the picture has Jacob Rees-Mogg and Richard Drax. There are two conservative MPs, and they're being promoted here as apparently doing some safety kind of campaign. And they are also answering on behalf of Boris Johnson, because this is the Daily Boris Graph. They don't call him Boris Johnson, they call him PM, which elevates the status to a level that it doesn't actually deserve. He should be called Boris Johnson, so that his personal limitations are exposed personally. Now, here is a very significant, typically significant contribution to the corruption by the bureaucrats in the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. So this is an attack on the migrants, and this so-called expert report has been made available to the Telegraph and the right wing to undermine the case for asylum and to undermine the case against the racist attacks on the migrants who are entitled and do qualify. The question arises about the United Nations High Commission for Refugees issuing the timing of this so-called information that 70% of the migrants don't qualify for asylum. Why have they issued this 2 weeks after the latest robust assault by the racist regime in Britain was commenced against the refugees? And there is a lot of insinuation against unnamed migrants that have been apparently seen more than once in the crowd. And so this is something that has to be examined on the evidence as to why the United Nations agency is playing this role at this time, instead of issuing statistics about the large numbers of those eligible to stay in the EU and entitled to seek refugees have been refused. So it is here and hereby that we confirm that we shall be including as a defendant or defendants any number of United Nations HCR personnel, employees, and spokesperson or agents or contractors in the violation of the human rights of the genuine seekers of refuge in the UK and in other EU countries. And so there is a revival of the racists and the right wings favorite Labour ex-education secretary, David Blunkett. So he is being dug out to issue a reference that suggests that grade inflation, this is the thing that is aimed against the state schools, will cause problems in clearing and university places take up and positions being made available. And the rest of the daily Boris graph is about the various excuses that give a persistent coverage and cover up for Boris Johnson. And it has got condemnation of the Public Health England. It has condemnation for others. And there is this right wing American plant, Kate Andrews, who is now economics. What is she now? She's the economics correspondent of the Weekly Spectator, which is the far right-wing weekly where Boris Johnson was apparently editor for a number of years, and it was a place where all these right-wing connections were consolidated before he mounted his challenge to become the mayor of London in 2008. And the Times has got a number of different stories that actually differ from the Telegraph, but Telegraph, there is the Boris graph. And these are stories of detail. So they are saying that there is evidence that after the A-level grade robbery, the quote authorities have decided to raise the grades in GCSE in all subjects, which is due in the very near future. And there is also a piece in the Times saying that UK faces wave of drugs if Taliban fighters are freed. Remember what we've been saying, that the reason why so many people from Africa and Asia want to migrate to places like the EU countries is linked with the behavior of these countries, Western countries, causing wars, maintaining wars, and so forth. Now, Taliban are in prison or in prisons as a direct result of continuing wars in Afghanistan caused by the West. So there is this spectre, the new spectre of wave of drugs if Taliban fighters are freed. Question is, who are the consumers of these drugs in the UK? Why do they never report as to who these consumers are? So we are saying that we are diagnosing a sick media, mainstream media in Britain, and the diagnosis goes straight to the sickness of the drugs that are used and consumed by the people, and the multi-trillion pound kind of trade is done in drugs across the world. And Britain is a big consumer of drugs. Now there is a piece which is, again, as I said, very rare in the Times, but this is in the wake of the Black Lives Matter campaign. Normally the Times would not run a story about police racism, but here it is. It says Black inspector sues force for racism, but racism they don't actually accept, even though they are reporting on his case, they don't accept the level of racism he is using against the particular police force that he is suing this black police inspector. So they put it within question marks. That is the marks. He says the black inspector is to sue Scotland Yard. They never say Metropolitan Police in London. It's Scotland Yard, which is completely misleading. So the black inspector is to sue Scotland Yard for racial harassment after two white officers stopped him in his car. Now this comes weeks after the Caribbean backgrounder Labour Party MP Don Butler made some headlines after she was stopped in East or Northeast London while traveling in a nice car with a fellow black person, a male one. So this black inspector is to sue the Metropolitan Police for racial harassment after two white officers stopped him in his car. Sounds like an African name, the second name. Charles Haque. Ehikioya. The spelling is either wrong or if it is right, then this is a name for the first time. I've seen it for the first time. So he's age 55. He believed that he was pulled over because of the color of his skin and disputed the officer's claims that he was driving unusually. His complaint is the latest about a series of stops in which officers at the Metropolitan Police have been accused of racial profiling. Mr. Ehi Kiyoya said that he had recorded the encounter, which happened as he returned home from work in South London on 23rd of May because he could see that the officer's body camera was not turned on as he approached the car. He told Today on BBC Radio 4 that he had no choice but to sue the force because his complaint was not taken seriously. We shall come to that, and the whole idea of the robust system in place in Britain that Boris Johnson was bragging about in justifying the robbery of the A-level results against the state school pupils. The idea that in Britain there is a robust, a fair judicial system is not supported by evidence. It is not my opinion only. It is evidence is that the courts system is completely corrupt. And when it comes to litigants or parties in court actions who are African or Asian, even before being Muslim, then the court system is totally racist and it is getting worse. And it is more thoroughly anti-Muslim than it was even before when, and it was always anti-Muslim, but the magnitude and the ferocity of its anti-Muslim propensities very much higher now than they were before. One of the Metropolitan Police officers said that they had stopped Mr. Ehi Kiyoya or Kiyoya, who was driving through Croydon, South London, because of his speed and because they believed that he had possibly gone through a red traffic light. And the officer, the Metropolitan Police officer, also asked for his driving license as well as proof that he was insured to drive the car, that the vehicle had not been stolen, that he was not intoxicated, and that he had not been using his phone. Now, all of these, in the way that this report is written, are speculation and hypothesis. And that is what is at the center of the outrage that Don Butler was giving voice to. And that is what has been happening for decades in the use of the police for maintaining the hostile environment. And this is the latest in that. And whatever the strength of the case, it is very unlikely that this particular action will succeed, even if the policeman is himself an inspector. And this is based on the evidence of the last, let's say, 60 years in Britain. And contrary to the mythology that the British Empire has ended, the imperial criteria of prejudice, bias, and disentitlement and disenfranchisement of African and Asian people very much alive. And the newspapers in the coverage, despite the Times running an apparently kind of straightforward headline, the newspaper coverage is festering in deep, deep racist ignorance, bias, and stupidity on the part of the press. And they've got a piece by Daniel Finkelstein. Now, the Finkelstein is a conservative member of the House of Peers who also has a column in the Times. And what he's doing, he is bringing back the spectre of Jeremy Corbyn as a symbol of that kind of politics which loses elections. And he's saying the headline is, even today, moderation still wins elections. Suggesting that Jeremy Corbyn represented extremism and lack of moderation. And this guy who is Roger Boyce, who is a card-carrying member of all things anti-Muslim, he is encouraging the idea that Turkey, a powerful Muslim state, is a greater threat than Iran. And that is being run in the context of the significant defeat inflicted by the so-called Gulf states on other Gulf state Muslims in betraying the rights of the Muslims under wars and under mass murders and massacres every day by other Muslim countries or their allies. And so therefore, what we have here is an agenda being pursued of violating human rights and humanitarian rights. On a day, 19th of August, 2021, the United Nations is celebrating or marking the celebration of humanitarianism and human rights. This is absolutely untrue. They are not observing human rights, they are doing a spin, which is why, despite the spin and despite the claims that they are for peace, the United Nations is reducing its own impact and it's undermining the founding charters and declarations of 10th of December 1948, which is why there are so many intentionally created victims of human rights violations across the world. And the violators are from the West, and the irony, multiple irony, the destinations for the violators to seek refuge are the very countries that are the violators. So it's a vicious cycle. And the vicious cycle is at its worst in the vicious cycle perpetuation of poverty creation and no sight of mitigation in the perpetuation of poverty creation, human rights violations. So we say that the world does not have the luxury of watching this and hoping that the violations will end. There have to be serious initiatives to stop the need for people to seek refuge and seek exodus and departures from their homelands. And that is by, first of all, addressing the lack of democracy, lack of justice, lack of civic rights, civil rights, and lack of economic stability and basic income. Universal basic income is a slogan which is as good for the asylum seekers and refugee seekers as it is for the people who are settled in those countries but are deprived of the basic universal income. So there is nothing, there are many pieces, continuing pieces about the robbery of the grades, but there is nothing. There is absolutely nothing about meeting the needs of the poor in the countries where they come from. And there is no evidence that the mainstream politics is being conducted by placemen and placewomen who have any regard for addressing the core issue of poverty and hunger. And we have to make that the actual behavior. And therefore, we have to do that by taking action against racists as an immediate step. But on the long term, we have to take action that can be taken by the people on the ground in those countries, in Africa and Asia, where they can use the available existing natural, ordinary resources, human resources, and the environmental resources to address the immediate needs of hunger and poverty, and also extend the application of that action to cover the rest of their lives and beyond. None of this is on the agenda of the United Nations, as we have seen. Wednesday, Daily Boris Graph, the Telegraph, is running a big story, allegedly based on the information given to it by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, which is itself condemning the refugee seekers. So, not only is there no action to uphold the United Nations 1951 Refugee Convention, but there is counter action by allegedly United Nations officials in place under the Refugee Council or Commission to violate the rights of the refugees at the present time and in the near future. So there is a void, huge void being created by the United Nations itself. And we are saying that there is a need for an international initiative program that covers all these voids and vacuums that have been created. And so we are supporting this, and we are actually initiating the campaign. And we shall be updating on those in due course as we go. There is a number of other things that we can talk about in the context of the pandemonium of this government fronted by Boris Johnson. And one of the crisis in our social care is in desperate state, and 15 major health bodies demand fix the crisis in our social care now. Now, this is something that this crisis has been building up for years, for decades, because since the 1940s and the claimed Labour kind of foundation of the NHS has never been held to account as a bureaucracy, as an organization that has been fleeced or used to fleece the main resources. And the fleecers have been the consultants and the others who want to scrap the NHS, and the others still who have been feeding the private sector in terms of medicine and other things that they buy in the name of the NHS. So the NHS has never been held to account. It has never been properly run. And the Labour Party has been asleep, except when it needs to cry a slogan, "Save our NHS." And so therefore, we have this crisis. 15 major health bodies demand fix the crisis in our social care now. It cannot be fixed, not overnight, because the culture, the narrative, and the language used have been totally hostile to an accountable, really deliverable, and available at the point of need service. And there has been no consensus, even among the so-called left, about the wrongs done to the social services and the care service and the NHS by the right wing dismantlers of the NHS. The NHS has been the victim of non-stop attacks by the conservatives right from the beginning in 1940s. And the Labour Party has not produced anywhere near a matching response to that, let alone in defense of the NHS, let alone in the promotion, in the advancement, in the defense of the provision of actual health service at the point of need. And it's evident everywhere. And it has been evident every single year. And whenever there has been a Labour so-called government, it has had Secretary of State or the Cabinet Minister in the name of health service. These people have been very hostile to the idea of society, the idea of social provision of care, to the idea of equality, to the idea of non-racist, let alone anti-racist and real provision of health service and health care at the point of need. So therefore, the pandemic, the actual data that has been available or published, despite the fact that it is not complete yet, that during the pandemic, the height of the pandemic in Britain, very large numbers of African and Asian people died. This is something that could have been predicted decades ago. And it will happen again, because although there has been headlines and, quote, expression of concern and the raising of, quote, questions, nothing systematically has been done or is being done or will be being done in the near future to hold the decision makers to account for the racism and the racist hostility and the racist denial of their full service to the people in their so-called care. So all of these we are saying here are products of long-standing, long-running, original investigation. So this diagnosis is covered by authorship rights, authoring rights, publishing rights. Publish or quote or mention these, but mention coherently and recognize the source, which is where it is written Khoodeelaar Television, and the editor is Muhammad Haque, that is myself, and you should be acknowledging that. And if you cannot acknowledge it, then it will be law breaking kind of liability will be attached to your refusal, your choice to not acknowledge. If you acknowledge, you will serve the cause of spreading the truth about defending the National Health Service, the care service, the social services in this country. And by extrapolation, you would be doing the same for other countries where caring and accountable health and care services and social services are desperately needed but are not available because of multiplicity of corruption that are plaguing the provisions or plaguing the establishment of those in some countries. So we shall be coming to this in due course again, but we are moving on to other little topics. And the item on the gossip column called Ephraim Hardcastle on the Daily Mail on page 19 is an item that is symptomatic of the sickness of Channel 4 executives. Remember, the Channel 4, as I said at the beginning of this particular edition, was founded as the alternative channel, alternative to the dull and dysfunctioning BBC One and BBC Two and the ITV at the time. The Channel 4, since the inception, since it was launched at the beginning of the 1980s as a fully running channel, it has been going down, it has been deteriorating from the day one. And this episode contained in the column in the Daily Mail gossip column called Ephraim Hardcastle. It concerns Ian Katz, K-A-T-Z. K-A-T-Z is a German word which means, if I am correctly informed, cats or cat. Ian Katz was the editor of the BBC Newsnight and he got back to Channel 4. He was previously a Guardian person. And he is now reported here as as involved in spending significant amount of rare Channel 4 money for a kind of pornographic documentary about men's genitalia. And so therefore, what is happening in the mainstream media in this country is what is happening in the behavior of Boris Johnson. It's dysfunctioning and it's not available, it's not visible anywhere. No trace of accountable, rigorous, mainstream, responsible journalism is visible. So this is what the Daily Star says about the missing invisible man Boris Johnson. And the mainstream media is also playing invisible role in relation to its duties to inform readers and the community and society of the serious failures and criminality that is going on in the regime fronted by Boris Johnson, and the dysfunction affecting all the agencies of the state. And we earlier talked about the corruption and criminality and racism of the judicial system or judiciary. And we have talked about the widespread racism operated via the Metropolitan Police. And we have talked about other issues that are symbolized in and represented in the robbery of the grades, other issues of dysfunction in the society. And essentially, we have said that all of this is to be seen in the context of worldwide hunger and famine and the desperate need to seek refuge created by war and war making and war trading done by the countries, including Britain, which are still running businesses creating wars. And it is the same countries that are supposedly among the top priority of the destinations that the victims of the desperate lack of housing, lack of safety, and the genocidal attacks, the massacres, those people seek refuges in these countries. And the answer, we have said earlier, lies in enabling the countries to use the local human power and the environmental resources and the cultural and social legacies and heritages to stop poverty at home and stop the need for seeking refuges away from home and in the undignified and hopeless states of Europe or North America. And the United Nations, whose founding charters were to stop war, the scourge of war, has been failing. So the people themselves in the African and Asian countries have to stop hoping that the United Nations would save them and must address their desperate needs with their own intelligence, their efforts, their labor, and their organization. So that is the message from this edition of the Diagnosis of the British press, Fleet Street, which rarely has this, the missing man who is in the Star, Daily Star. Now this front page has been shown on a much shorter kind of video that is broadcast daily by an activist called the Artist Taxi Driver. Chunky Mark is the handle on Twitter. So he is the one who has done this, but we have done it more extensively because we have shown it for longer and in the whole context of the rest of the front pages. And we are talking about diagnosing the media, and we shall be continuing in the next edition. And in the next edition, we shall be also talking about the London boroughs of Tower Hamlets, Newham, Lambeth, and we shall focus on Oldham in Greater Manchester, which today, Wednesday, the 19th of August 2020, is in local nervous state because the UK central government has said that Oldham is now in serious danger because the pandemic is spreading there rapidly. So a serious long-term lockdown like Leicester's needs to be imposed on it. We shall be talking about all of that in the next edition. Until then, this is 5 minutes to 3 in the evening, that is 14:55 GMT on Wednesday, the 19th of August 2020.